Past 11, so let's get cracking. Others, I'm sure, will join. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to our event, which is in partnership with Policy at Manchester, which is part of the University of Manchester. The event today is focused on the changing nature of work, and in particular, the types of skills that employers are looking for, and how this varies across cities and towns, and obviously the implications for skills and employment support that we're going to need to seriously ramp up in the next months and weeks ahead. So it's kind of interesting to think about not only the support that is needed, but actually the types of skills that our employers are looking for in the changing nature of the labour market and the economy more generally. In a moment, we're going to hear from our two speakers, Elena Magrini and Tony Dundon. As always, the event is being recorded. It'll be made available after the event on our website, along with the slides. For those new to Zoom, can't be many of us left now. Best off if you put it on speaker view. And as I've said, if you can keep your microphones on mute while you're listening, you can obviously unmute when I ask you to ask your questions. The hashtag for the event is CFC Future of Work. After the contributions of about 25 minutes, we'll open up for about 30 minutes of questions. If you have questions, you can submit them via the chat function to ask a question. You can do it during the presentations. Obviously, you can wait until the end. We'll be looking through them and trying to draw out those, where we have a kind of interest or a lot of interest in different issues, and we'll be done by 12 o'clock as always. So our first speaker is my colleague, Elena Magrini. Elena is a senior analyst at the Centre for Cities and leads on all of our work in relation to labour markets, skills and employment policy. So, Elena, over to you.
Thanks, Andrew. So obviously in the last few weeks, we talked a lot about the immediate effects of coronavirus in the labour market. But we also know that there were a lot of trends going on before coronavirus that were shaping how demand for skills and demand for jobs was changing, and how we were seeing different workers and the role they played in our cities. So what I'm going to do in this presentation today is take a step back from the immediate coronavirus threat and look at how the labour market was changing and how this play out in relation with coronavirus and the pandemic, and what this means in terms of going forward in terms of policy implications. Why are we talking about it and why are we talking about skills? As I'm sure everybody on this call would agree, we know that skills are a key factor in determining the success of people and places. We know from quite a large literature that people that have more skills and that have the right skills and qualifications are more likely to be in employment and to earn higher wages. And we also know that from a place perspective, places where people are more likely to have the right skills and qualifications tend to have higher employment rates and higher productivity. So having the right skills is really important for the success of both people and places in the present moment. And it is also a key determinant of their ability to be able to adapt to a changing labour market and world of work. Pre-COVID, there were a number of trends that were affecting the labour market in many different ways. We knew automation and technological change were reshaping the nature of many works. We knew that globalization, for example, were changing the balance in between what was being done at home and what was being done elsewhere across the world. We knew demographic change, concerns about the environment and increasing inequalities were all reshaping the way we were thinking about the labour market. And what we know now is that normally during a crisis, like the one created by coronavirus, labour market trends that were ongoing are likely to be exacerbated and accelerated by the crisis. And that's why it's really important to think about the two things together rather than separate, because first of all, there's going to be an acceleration mechanism. And second of all, now is more important than ever to try and understand these trends, so that when we're responding to COVID-19, we're not just helping people to bounce back to the labor market, but we're also preparing them for what the labor market will look like 10 years and 20 years down the line. So with that in mind, I'd like to talk about three main trends that we've been seeing happening in the labor market in the past few years and that are likely to continue in the future. First one, we knew that some occupations were very likely to disappear by 2030. Work done by Nesta in 2017 showed that there were approximately 35 occupations at high risk of disappearing by 2030. Most of these occupations were in routine, low skill activities in many different broad categories of sectors and occupations. So think about sales assistants and retail, for example, warehousing and storage, administration, customer services, and some jobs in the construction industry as well. Now, we know that these jobs have been affected differently by coronavirus. If you think about many of the admin jobs, some of these probably are likely to be able to be continued to be carried on from home. Some other, like retails, have been completely put on a halt because of the lockdown and are likely to look very different for coming months because of the social distancing restrictions that have been put in place and will continue to be in place for the coming months. And what that actually means is that when we're thinking about retail jobs and when businesses are thinking about how to reopen, they might as well consider different ways to reopen that can help them adapt to social distancing and so keep their business going, but might require less people. So accelerating a trend that we were expecting to see by 2030, we might start seeing it sooner, or we might start seeing businesses starting to think about it much sooner than what we predicted. Second thing that we were seeing in the labor market before coronavirus, and that was quite a trend that was ongoing for a few years, we were seeing a shift in between the type of skills that were more in demand in the labor market. In recent years, we saw a decline in the demand for manual physical skills, whereas we saw a shift and an increase in demand for analytical and interpersonal skills, such as negotiation, persuasion, ability of problem solving, or critical thinking. And this wasn't new. It's something that we've seen for the past few decades, and this is likely to continue in the future as the UK continues to shift towards a more service-based economy. So it's something that gives us a sense of the direction in which the country is heading to in terms of the type of sector of growth and the type of skills that these sectors will require. And thirdly, we also seen a rise in self-employment and new ways of working. Compared to 2004, there are now 20% more people working as self-employed than at the beginning of the century. And approximately there are 5 million people today that are working as self-employed. So that's quite a large rise, and means that approximately 15% of the current workforce is now self-employed. And it's quite interesting to see how people come to become self-employed, and for example, how they react to different economic shocks. Because, for example, when we looked at the financial crisis and the growth in self-employment since the financial crisis, what we've seen is that immediately after the financial crisis, people responded by turning into self-employment, so rapid growth in self-employment, but self-employment as the only source of income. So people were losing their jobs and were finding different ways to get by being self-employed. After the immediate short-term reaction to the financial crisis, instead, self-employment continued to rise, enabled by things like the gig economy and technological changes. But the majority of people started to be self-employed as an additional source of income, so to complement their other sources of income. And we could think that this crisis might as well see a similar pattern. And we could also think about it in a different way by considering how especially gig economy workers like Deliveroo drivers and others have been able to keep us going, have helped us to keep us going during this crisis. So 3 trends, and one important thing to remember when we talk about these trends is that they don't often play out equally across the country. When we actually look, for example, at the impact of jobs that are likely to disappear by 2030, we know that 21% of all jobs overall in urban Britain are likely to disappear by 2030. 3.6 million overall. But when we look at where they are across the country, we see large variations. And places like Mansfield, Wakefield, or Sunderland are way more exposed to the risks of automation and technological changes than places like London or Cambridge or Reading, for example. And it is not just that the jobs at risk in different places matter, but it also matters the type of skills that are available in different economies. Because what we see is that the places that are most at risk in terms of demand for jobs are also the ones that have lower achievements in terms, for example, of schools results. So what that means is that they're more exposed to changes in the labor market, but they also have fewer people that are able to take up these new changes. And that's just not with the considering younger generation entering the labor market, but it is also the case when we're thinking about adult education. Adult education is in decline everywhere, and it is declining faster in places that are more exposed to these risks in the changing labor market. Meaning that people don't have the tools they need to be able to adapt to these changes. So what does this all mean in the context of COVID and for policy going forward? Well, first of all, these changes were already happening before the crisis, and the crisis and the pandemic are likely to accelerate in these trends. Some places are in a better position to adapt to these changes than others, because they have fewer jobs at risk, but also they have a wider skills set that they can use to adapt to these changes. And what this all means in practice is that now more than ever, urgent investment in skills is needed. Now, this is something that was needed nevertheless, because we needed to be prepared for these changes in 10 years down the line. But now what the crisis has done, what the crisis has meant is that we can no longer wait, and we need to address these challenges right now. So what then does that mean in practice? What can the government do? We can broadly split what the government could do into groups. National government, on one end, should increase investment in skills in a number of different ways. First of all, we need to see improved quality, schools quality, especially in left behind areas, which are the areas that at the moment have the lowest achievement and are the ones that actually need it the most. And if we think about it in the context of COVID, these are also the places that, in which children have been hardest hit by the impact of schools closures. So gapping between between better off and less advantaged children widening due to coronavirus, and this needs to be reversed. Second of all, we need to level up investment in further education. We know that in recent years, investment in further education has been cut quite substantially. But if we're thinking about a response to coronavirus, how to reduce the number of people that are unemployed, further education will play a significant role, and it needs to have the adequate funding to support all the people that are likely to go through the system. And third of all, which is also extremely important, we need to reverse that downward trend in adult education and create a culture of lifelong learning and invest much more in adult education, for example, by creating a Singapore style of lifelong learning accounts for adults. That means every adult is assigned a certain amount of credit they can use each year for retraining, and that could be particularly relevant with the phase out of the job retention scheme in terms of supporting workers that are likely to lose their jobs. Obviously, government faced a big challenge, and the local areas can also play a role in this. And thanks to their convening powers and thanks to their role as coordinators of activities at the local level, they can help improve take-up and quality of education. One thing we often advocate for is the creation of skills compact at the local level, which basically mean local authorities taking the lead in terms of bringing local stakeholders together, businesses, education providers, third sector organizations, to ensure the younger generation are prepared to enter for the labor market of the future, and that adults are supported in this transition. And in practice, this means that a skills compact could focus on mapping existing provision at the local level, which is often fragmented, promoting efficiency in the system and reducing duplication, and promoting experimentation. So these are some of the things that national and local government could do about it in terms of skills, but obviously there are also other things that we need to think about in terms of employment legislations and other broader questions around these workers, which is what Tony is going to talk about afterwards. So now I'm going to hand over back to Andrew. Thank you.
Elena, thank you very much indeed. Lots of things to think about, particularly, I think, as always, yes, we're in the middle of a pandemic, which is having a serious health and economy effect on the country, but we mustn't lose sight of or downplay some of those pre-existing trends that Elena was talking about and the way that they are playing out in the labour market, and the degree to which the current crisis will accelerate or make them more difficult, more challenging to deal with, which we can pick up when we get into the Q&A. But let's turn to Tony. Before that, sorry, you keep asking your questions of Elena. Put them in the ask a question through the chat function. When we've heard from Tony, we'll get into those sorts of conversations. So as I say, our second speaker is Tony Dundon. Tony's a professor of work and employment relations at the University of Limerick and a visiting professor at the University of Manchester, and has been doing some fascinating work, in particular looking at aspects of the gig economy from the worker perspective. Tony, it's great to have you. Over to you.
Right, thank you very much, and thank you for the invite, Andrew, and well done to Eleanor. I mean, some fascinating reports and data there. So I must confess that I'm part of a larger research team. Christina Inversi at the University of Manchester, who has been doing most of the research on gig economy workers in particular cities, and we have a Policy at Manchester blog, I think, out today or this week, also including Ord Schiafelio, who is at Glasgow University, which has a particular health and safety angle. So I don't have any slides. I'm just going to run through perhaps some points and debates about gig economy work, about maybe try and contextualize that into cities, and maybe mention more broadly about issues of technology and skills. So, and on the backdrop of the COVID-19 crisis, of course, there's this issue and this question about how or will we value workers in the future. Perhaps those workers who have even been undervalued in the past, will any of that change? There is a group of economists, or there's an economic school of thought, which looks at what might be called the foundational economy. And that pays particular attention to aspects of the economy that have really come to the forefront during the crisis. Areas and people who have kept the economy going. Not bankers or chief executives, but shop assistants, delivery drivers, and in part the gig economy falls into that. And that's some of the research that we've been doing recently with colleagues at the University of Manchester. And I'm sure most people know, but for clarity, the gig economy and gig workers are those who they provide a service to end user clients. That service is mediated, it's channeled through a digital labour platform. And that platform is accessed using a variety of technologies. So the likes of Deliveroo or Uber or Just Eats, they often come to mind when we think of the gig economy or the gig worker. But there are many others, and there are different types of digital labor platforms that also have a particular analytical focus on place and space. So there are particular platforms where people might work on a laptop doing what we're doing now, but can be located anywhere in the world. You might work on professional service projects. Deliveroo and Uber is channeled through the technology, but it's delivered in a local space. Now, the gig economy and gig workers have a particular issue going on in relation to rights. So gig workers do not enjoy or have access to the same rights as other citizens. They're defined as independent contractors, according to the Taylor Review recently in the UK, or self-employed. So they fall into that change in the labour market that Elena was describing. Now, what our research tries to argue, as does many others, is that's pretty much a sham. These are really workers in the real sense of the word. They're not running a business. They're not a freelancer in the true definition. And the reason this becomes important is because key gig workers do not enjoy the same contract status and rights as others. So they don't have opportunities to avail of the national minimum wage, the living wage, of holiday pay, of maternity leave or paternity leave. They don't have the same rights under health and safety protections. And some of the research that we have indicated in the blog, the Policy at Manchester blog, suggests that that has been particularly acute during the COVID crisis. Now, the whole gig economy has been argued by some, and particularly some in government, that it creates a new entrepreneurial class. Our analysis tends to suggest that that is mostly a myth. It's not entirely untrue, but it's mostly a myth. And the reason is the business model is predicated on a very early mercantile version of 19th century capitalism. So think of a Deliveroo rider or an Uber driver. They have to own their own capital. They have to own a bike, a bicycle, a motorcycle, or a car. If you're working for Mechanical Turk, you have to own a computer and be able to access and have the skills to engage in that sort of work. So the business model devolves the risk to the individual, not the company or the client. So in terms of the general trend and impacts, about, as Elena said, about 20%, there's been about 20% increase in self-employed people, about 5 million in the UK. We don't know how many of that is in the gig economy, but some of the research we do know is that there are about 25,000 self-employed couriers who work for Deliveroo in the UK at the end of 2019. And in the likes of, say, London or Cambridge, this is where there's a regional geographical spatial difference. Some of the self-employed earn extra income, whereas in some of the less wealthier cities, they are earning their sole income in this way. So there is a distribution of equality and inequalities effect. Now, we don't know that all of these self-employed people are in the gig economy. And as a predictor, it's very difficult to know the size. There are variations from 0.4 to about 5% of the labour force, but they're just unfounded. But when we look at the gig economy workers themselves, what we can find is about 42% of delivery drivers and Uber riders have reported damage to their vehicle, to their own personal human capital that they've had to invest in. About 63% of gig economy workers who deliver food or drive said they've not been provided with any training in terms of health and safety, and they have to occupy the risks on the road themselves. And about half of gig workers have lost their jobs, or they've had their income cut by about 2/3 because of the COVID crisis. There's other aspects to gig work. So Deliveroo riders sometimes have to go to different areas of cities and spaces that put themselves in a personal risk. They face accidents and injuries on the road. There are platforms, the digital platforms use various modes of technological surveillance, which monitors them by time. So the links to skills and the links to the quality of their work never feature in the monitoring of such workers. So these impacts create a particular exposure to individuals rather than to the system or the business model. So it starts to suggest that there are considerable limitations and failures to a self-regulated model. broadly, when we talk about skills and the future of technology, it's almost impossible these days not to, I don't know, pick up the Financial Times or some academic research article from Harvard or somewhere that doesn't say that jobs are going to be replaced by technology. Now, again, mostly, I know Eleanor referred to occupations that are at high risk, and that's true. But it's a myth that occupations and industries are going to change. What's going to happen is the nature of work changes and the nature of skills change. And that's where the debate then becomes more important for the future of work. And that's where those who we haven't valued in care work and delivery, hairdressing, customer-facing service occupations, maybe those undervalued occupations now have got a sort of a renewed renaissance in terms of how they've kept society going as part of this foundational economy. So in terms of, you know, the summary argument or the summary message, cities and geographical locations have a particular labour market context that can be unique. We can visualize where we live, often in cities where Deliveroo riders congregate waiting for work. The technology draws them into work when demand is high, but often when demand is high, there's too many riders and drivers to take the work that's on offer. So people are waiting around for long periods of time, getting unpaid. These same workers have often been keeping sections of the economy going during the COVID crisis, small businesses and restaurants. And certainly in some of these stricter lockdown situations in cities around the world, these employees have never stopped working. They've exposed themselves to considerable hazards, to considerable health risks, and without any personal protective equipment that is provided by companies or the clients or the platforms that they work for. So while there may be a truism that many gig workers do want to be self-employed, to require that as a mandatory condition of gig work is unsatisfactory. And there's probably 4 policy areas, if you like, 4 debates that can be addressed in terms of this valuing undervalued work that we might suggest. One is the need for some legal clarity for all, whether you're independent or whether you're employed. Now that's politically contentious, but nonetheless, it's important. Second and third class status rights and health and safety risks should not be based upon contract status. And we know the courts have intervened in some areas in Uber and Deliveroo, and there's been very mixed outcomes to legal cases. And even now as we speak, the Attorney General of California in San Francisco, in Los Angeles, in San Diego, has filed an injunction against gig companies. And the claim is to grant employment status to gig workers in Uber and others who want it. A second area, in addition to legal clarity, is voice and social dialogue. The pandemic has brought people together in a much more collaborative spirit, much more than we've seen for a long time. And what that can be is an agenda to re-establish trust and transparency in decision-making. And that provides opportunities for hierarchical voice and social inclusion about decision-making in organizations. So this might be supporting unionization, legitimizing collective bargaining at a sector level, including non-business stakeholders such as civil society organizations or NGOs in supporting marginalized groups. There are opportunities to redistribute productivity gains from technology or artificial intelligence from one sector to another, and that requires hierarchical voice in decision-making. So that might be prioritizing areas of the foundational economy in delivery and healthcare, local authority services. It might overlap into local authority training provision, tax incentives or training levies, some process of redistributing gains from one sector to another. And finally, there is perhaps an area for public concern on health and safety. So devolve powers to things like the Health and Safety Executive. There is an employment enforcement agency in the UK, and maybe they can have some local authority roles within cities. But delivery riders are having accidents on public streets. And a lot of that is down to the design of the business model, which is based on a venture capitalist model. And it's not based on any conversations of public interest discussion. So no one regulates or monitors the digital labour platforms as intermediary agencies. So these are areas of public discussion. So perhaps I'll end it on that point, Andrew, and I'll happy to address any questions. And again, thank you for the invitation.
Fantastic. Thank you very much indeed. Tony, it picks up lots of different issues. I wonder, just starting off straight away, Tony, with just your reflections on, obviously the Taylor Review, looked at many of these issues, and do you think in a sense it didn't go far enough, and particularly in relation to legal clarity around this unclear sort of status of gig workers? Would you want to see more of that happening? And then, so that's one kind of, and I'd be interested in your thought, the balance, as always, between the flexibility of this sort of work versus regulation and more terms and conditions, and the balance in getting the trade-offs, which obviously there would be trade-offs. How do we get those? How do we get those right, Tony?
Yeah, again, I mean, they're not easy answers for sure.
No.
The Taylor Review, in the end, I thought was a missed opportunity. It offered considerable potential, but didn't go anywhere near far enough. It wasn't reinventing the wheel. It simply needed to make more clear, stronger decisions on contract status and contract rights. And where I think it let itself down is it didn't include the broad spectrum of stakeholders that it could have done. There was very few trade union or TUC voices that entered into the Taylor Review debate. So there's been considerable criticism of its process and how it arrived at its decisions. And secondly, some criticism on how far it went or how far it didn't go. So independent contractor was very much a middle way, a third way to try and balance those competing demands between flexibility and efficiency. And certainly businesses need to have opportunities and degrees of flexibility, but providing legal clarity does not mean that some people cannot avail or opt in to freelancer or independent contractor status. Yep. That can be an opportunity rather than a mandatory right. I probably gravitate to, there's a German economist, Wolfgang Streeck. What Streeck often argued is you need to have what's called beneficial constraints. You impose constraints on business and industry that they don't like, but society as a whole benefits from those constraints. But it's the parameters of how we do that. And the hierarchical voice and decision-making is processes that I can argue that would perhaps help towards that end.
Excellent. Okay, very good. Let's open it up for some questions. As I said before, if I'll say your name, if you can get ready to unmute your microphone, ask your question, and then I'll go to Tony and Eleanor. And the first question I want to go to, because I think it touches on many aspects and broader points, is Olivia Grant. Olivia, and particularly your question, I know you had more than one, but you asked the question about the role of FE and actually more particularly the role of employers, which I want to explore in a bit more detail with Tony and Ella. So you kick us off with your question.
Thank you very much. My concern is this, and Eleanor pointed, and I know there is huge expertise in FE colleges to provide training. And I know there have been material changes in the training infrastructure in our country, and this has particularly affected cities. But I was interested that your immediate response was to quote FE colleges as the providers of training, because surely, for me, the most important thing is standards-based training, as flexibly delivered as possible, because I think employers need flexibility and individuals prefer flexibility in the provision of training, but that employers are fully engaged in this. So I was intrigued that you immediately said it should be FE college, or it would be FE colleges. And I know in the Northeast, and I'm from Newcastle, that the majority of work and effort is being put in by FE colleges. I don't want employers to get left behind, because I want them to start having a greater feeling of commitment to and desire to employ the people who are going through training programs. And this interface between people and employers must not be lost. It's tenuous at the moment anyway, but it must not be lost.
Fantastic point. That's a very good point, Olivia. Great. Eleanor, so, this point about where do employers sit in this? How significant they should be in the construction.
Sorry, yeah. I just bear with me 1 second. I'm trying.
So someone else, if you're chatting away, if you can put your microphones on mute if you're having other conversations, that would be deeply helpful to everyone else. But Eleanor, that definitely wasn't you, but now it is you.
Yes, I mean, I completely agree with Olivia. FE colleges play an important role, but it shouldn't just be that. Employers should be involved too.
Bex, yeah.
So somebody's got their microphone off mute and is having a conversation which is distracting to everyone else. So do me a favor, other than Eleanor and myself, can you put your microphones on mute, or no longer have the conversation close to the microphone? It's entirely up to you. Eleanor, start again.
Yeah, no, my whole point is that I agree with Olivia. I think it's really important that employers are directly involved into this conversation. I think the balance, it should be somewhere in between a responsibility for the individuals to train, of employers to get involved, especially if we think about retraining your own staff and promoting in work progression, for example, and helping staff, supporting staff progress, for example, from lower skills level to higher or more senior positions. And there's a role for the government as well. I suppose in a moment like this, especially if we think a lot of employers are likely to make people redundant, we could argue that the state plays a particular role in incentivizing employment and training. So that's why the attention on FE colleges in particular. But I absolutely agree with you that it shouldn't be on the exclusion of employers, and we should find other ways too. And I agree with the point about short and flexible courses. We hear this time and time again, that more flexibility in the system, providing shorter courses, letting employers do modules in work or outside the working hours, can make a big difference in this space.
Excellent, thank you very much. And Olivia, it was a fantastic question. Stay with you for a minute, Eleanor, and bring Tony in, because it does seem to be a quirk in relation to some of the gig-based companies that they're not legally allowed to provide training to people who work or don't work, for them, and that creates somewhat of an anomaly in how we think about improving the skills of workers in the sort of gig economy. Just say a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I mean, Tony will know this area much better than me, but yes, how it works is that if you provide training, that comes under the definition of being you're employing somebody. So people that are self-employed would not qualify for training. But what that actually also means, it means that people that are self-employed, and sometimes, especially if we think about a sector like transport, these are also jobs that can be a high risk of being automated in the future. So these are people that could actually benefit from some sort of training. That means that these people are getting left out, and we know that the take-up of training for people that are self-employed is much, much lower than for employees.
And there's one more quirk, which is in relation to how training can be treated by the self-employment through the tax system. Just finish us off on that one as well.
Yes. So the other things about self-employment is that you can detract the cost of many things from, you can deduct the cost of training from your taxes, but you cannot do that for if the training is not directly relevant to your profession. So again, if you think about self-employed workers in an industry that's very likely to see changes in the futures that might need to retrain for something completely different, it is not allowed to do so in the same way as somebody that's an employee would be.
So this is a kind of classic, I think, in some respects, of a tax system, understandably in many instances, a tax system that is lagging with the patterns that we see in the labour market, particularly the growth of self-employment. And, if you think about the current circumstances, the real need and desire to incentivize individuals that are currently working as well as those that aren't to acquire new skills for the next job, not necessarily for the skills for the current job. And I think there's always a tax role that should be played when we're doing that. Tony, your reflections on the kind of dynamics in this sort of space.
Yeah, well, I'm not particularly up on any tax laws, but it certainly sounds, it's a bit prohibitive if you can claim tax incentives if you're self-employed, but only in your particular occupation is very narrow. It doesn't allow you to expand your skills and direct. But go maybe 2 points. One is the gig economy and the digital platforms. They're not incentivized to provide training because of the business model as an intermediary. And as Eleanor said, the language and narrative is you don't work for Deliveroo, you work with Deliveroo. So you can't get training because you might have a legal case to say you are of employee status. You don't wear a uniform, you wear the badge and the names, but it's not as part of an employee's uniform. So the business model doesn't allow even gig economies or digital platforms that might want to invest in training for their own quality purposes. The second part of the gig economy company is the technology provides a high degree of control through algorithms. So if you drive for Deliveroo or for Uber, if your customer rating isn't, 4.6, the algorithm can exclude you from future work. So the ability to have experience becomes prohibited by the control of the technology and the algorithms behind the interface of the platform. And maybe just to reflect on, Olivia's comment was great, and there used to be training boards. There used to be this notion of social dialogue where employers would actually engage with further education colleges as well as other stakeholders, because it's employers who know what skills they want in 5 and 10 years' time. The educational colleges on themselves might not necessarily know. So that's what I mean by hierarchical social dialogue in terms of decision making, of thinking those through. So further education colleges are important, but if employers are left out, then it's just simply going to become an increasingly permissive, voluntarist and individualized type of arrangement, which is not going to have any longer term forward planning. So that's just a few reflections, if you like, on
excellent. Very good. No, great reflections as well. Let's go, because actually carries on this theme. Irshad, you've got a question around employers' role, but also how do we encourage them not to cut training precisely at the moment when it's probably most needed because they're in the face of survival. So Irshad, if you're there, unmute and just ask your question.
Yeah, Andrew, you pretty much, can you hear me, sorry?
Yes, perfectly. Go on.
Brilliant. Yeah, you've pretty much summarized my question right there. How do we get employers to engage in upskilling the workforce when, we're going through a period where focus is on business survival?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And I think, as always, it's the kind of thinking about the short term and the long term, and some of these things, the worry and investment from workforce touches on a point also that Ian Brandon made about how do we encourage through reputation as much as through regulation firms to be wanting to be good employers, to be seen as good employers. We've seen things like the Greater Manchester Employment Charter, kind of living wage movements in different cities, London particularly, but not exclusively, trying to create place-based responses to draw employers in. Eleanor, your thoughts on that, the short term, the long term? How do we encourage reputation as well as regulation?
Yes, when we're thinking about how we can help employers or we can convince employers to invest more in skills, we also need to think about how the system is in place and which incentives there are in the system as it is now to help employers take up training. We know that employers find, for example, the existing system quite confusing, quite fragmented. So providing stability in the system, some clear funding mechanisms that they can access, less red tape around how they can apply for these different schemes, and also more flexibility in the type of courses that they can use to train their workforce. We know, for example, that employers value shorter courses and flexible modules, and that is not always how the system works in practice in terms of training provision. So getting more flexibility in the system so that the training can be adapted to employers' need would certainly help. In the immediate time, obviously the situation with coronavirus is making everything more difficult. there are mechanisms that could help businesses take up training. For example, we know that employers are required, especially large employers, to pay the apprenticeship levy. It could be ways around introducing incentives in the systems, using the levy, for example, to pay for the wages of the apprentice could help employers take up more of these opportunities than they would otherwise in this situation. And then, as Andrew said, it is not just about improving skills, but also improving being good employers. And that's something that at the local level is being done quite well in many areas. And it's something that we should look into more for different parts of the countries as well.
Brilliant. Thanks very much. So, Tony, you talked obviously about the regulatory side, and that's obviously incredibly important and provides the base for for many of these companies. Your thoughts on the reputational bit? How far can we push that?
Yeah, I think that's extremely important. I mean, there's large employers that want to be, seen as a good employer, a model employer, and that used to be a public policy goal some decades ago. The public sector was seen as a model employer. So you can have large organizations, you can have employers showcasing how to support training, to support future skills. But then at the same time, small and medium-sized enterprises, the reality is it's a high risk for many to invest in training of individuals should they lose those individuals. So we need some more collaborative system to mitigate the risks in the longer term of smaller businesses that might support training and skills, maybe through employer federations, maybe through local further education colleges, but some sort of levy system. So large employers can provide apprenticeships, can provide more deeper training and showcase that as a model employer. And then there can be debates and sort of conversations about how to mitigate the risks of investing in training among smaller and medium-sized enterprises. So that's a sort of a short and medium-term sort of observation, I guess.
Yeah, no, I think you're spot on in terms of the sort of collectivized nature of some of the responses. Obviously, as everyone knows, the construction industry training board, long established, essentially exactly deals with or tries to deal with that problem where individual firms are reluctant to invest because they lose the benefits because the worker is highly mobile given the structure of the industry. You collectivize the response across the industry to capture the spillovers and the externalities associated with that. We've often thought about whether, given local labor markets, whether you could almost have area-based type variations on the construction levy, in a sense that you would have, at the area scale, you might be doing some of those sorts of things through different tax and fiscal incentives, which I think is really interesting. I'm just going to flip Henry Kelly. Henry, if you're still on the call, can you ask your question? It's specifically about the rail industry, but it touches on a broader point about how we kind of help workers move from certain industries into other industries. Henry, are you there? Yeah, you are.
Yeah. Hello, Andrew. Yeah. So, so just thinking about skills, there's some sectors I'm particularly aware of the rail construction industry, but I think it applies more broadly where there's really a large-scale structural labour shortage and huge supply chain pressure, and that is really across all skill levels. And recently, this has actually been accompanied by very considerable real wage increases over the last 5 years or so. Just wondering, what are the sort of barriers that prevent labour supply shifting to these sectors, given that there are good wage terms and conditions?
Yeah, it's a great question. How do we why don't we see rational responses to job opportunity and high wages? Why don't we see workers flowing into these kind of areas? And I think it also touches on another issue we've been exploring, Eleanor, which is about how the government signals to individuals and to industries that government investment over the next 5 or 10 years is going to be prioritized into certain activities, and therefore allows firms and individuals to respond from a skills development point of view. Eleanor, just pick up that point.
Yeah, I mean, I can think of a couple of issues there. First of all, yes, it's basically lack of awareness or a lack of clear information from national government of these opportunities. And it's something that if somebody's in your network that is involved in these kind of opportunities, that is working in these kind of sectors, they might know it much better, and therefore you get the opportunity yourself. Otherwise, there's little direction from the government in terms of where we're trying to see growth in the future, what kind of investment we're trying to put. And there's also not a signal, for example, in the education and training system. There's no clear understanding of that. And then second of all, there's also a point around where these jobs are across the country, and where are people actually looking for jobs. Because sometimes there is a clear mismatch geographically in terms of where the opportunities are and where the people seeking opportunities are. And what we know is that, especially when we're thinking about people with fewer qualifications and lower skills, we know they're very much tied to the labor market in which they are, and the mobility is quite small. So only approximately 60% or over of people with lower skill qualification never leave the labor market in which they grew up in. So that also plays quite a big factor in that.
And the other aspect, which you touched on in your policy thoughts, I'll just say a little bit more around, is, you know, what's often overlooked, the importance of the coordination function that, you know, whether you call it advice, information, advice and guidance, or, you know, the kind of matching process that we're going to need to do probably much more, and particularly in weak labour markets. But just emphasize that a little bit more.
Yeah, I mean, when we've done this research on the future of work, we consulted with some cities about what their plans are, what they've been doing. And the thing that was most appalling was that actually there are so many great initiatives, both on businesses getting involved and different training opportunities in every part of the country. The thing is, there's something missing in joining the dots between the different opportunities. So employers don't talk with the education providers, or the funding mechanisms means that the courses that employers would want do not match with the provision at the local level. And this creates a number of inefficiencies at the local level, and numbers of also duplications in the systems that don't allow for a more efficient use of resources at the local level. And yeah, and this is particularly visible in weaker economies, especially also in terms of lack of understanding of what employers in those areas need.
Excellent. Tony, your thoughts on, you know, how do we I suppose improve the efficiency of the crudely of the labour market so that workers, you know, are getting the right signals to or individuals are getting the right signals to go and invest in, you know, in skills that are in higher demand or in long-term demand. What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, probably not much. It's an area I'm you know, not got much expertise in terms of labour supply. It's a very good question, Henry. And you know, if you think of, I don't think human beings are rational economic objects. They don't make these decisions in some void. So there's a whole set of social and psychological factors that come into play. So, and Elena mentioned, you know, awareness. That's one aspect. But I think perhaps more importantly is, you know, family ties, geographical location, the industry, not only the industry, but where it's located. These are likely to affect the whole decision on changing a job. And if it's to move somewhere else, then it's got to be of some substantial benefit. There's got to be future planning for skills. There's got to be future opportunities. So it's not just an immediate job decision on a salary. It's a whole set of complicated factors that lie behind it. And again, what can be done to try and correct that? I'm not sure. You can start paying people more. And Henry mentioned the rail sector. I mean, a lot of the agents are subcontracted firms. It's highly privatized. It's fragmented. There's a lot of disconnection in terms of employment rights and employment securities in a lot of those privatized rail subcontracting firms. So that adds a psychological degree of security or insecurity, you know, what people know. So I confess that I don't know much expertise on the labor supply side of the labor market, but there's a whole set of complicated issues.
No, well, and industry structure is really quite an important point about the flow of information through all those. Complete and utter naked advert. We are going to be doing an event in early July. The date escapes me now, with Understanding Society around precisely looking at issues in relation to the labour market, geographical mobility, and the factors, economic and non-economic, that actually inform the decisions that people make to move or not to move. So you can find details of that on our website, which will be a fascinating exploration of all of some of these sorts of questions and issues. I want to close by asking my own question. To come to you first, Alan, and then to you, Tony, for the final thought. You know, since the crisis, we've seen a growth and an interest in working from home, and you know, some people say it's the future, and some say it's part of the future, but probably not as big as people currently think it's going to be. But I want to ask a different question or a different angle on it to you, Eleanor. You know, you talked earlier on about the kind of skills or the attributes that employers are looking for. You know, and many of those are social in orientation. They're acquired by on the job. You know, literally working alongside people, you acquire the attributes and the insights, whether it's teamwork and problem solving. They're not formal skills in the sense that we often think about them. How does that interact with working from home? In a sense, if people are, particularly younger people are working from home, the ability to acquire social skills and on-the-job skills. What's your thought on that?
I mean, that's a really good question, and we know that, especially when we're thinking more towards an economy that's more service-based, with our more and more professional jobs, these skills are more important than ever. And if you are at the beginning of your career, for example, and you need to acquire all these new skills, acquiring them through Zoom might not be exactly the same as trying to acquire them in the office. In terms of data to back this up, we don't have anything in particular in terms of the effect of working from home and its impact on young people and how they will progress into the labor market. But we can kind of say that it would probably have a negative effect on their opportunities, especially as we know that, for example, in our industries, there's a really important role played by the network you create and the connections you make, and these are very hard to be made via technology. Yeah,
that's a good point. Yeah, and you probably could tell those listening from the nature of my contribution and question, I'm deeply skeptical about since the conversations about working from home, which seem to be currently all on the upside, and no recognition or consideration of the downside of this, which there will be several, not just in a labour market and skills perspective, but on a whole other bunch of issues, not least in relation to transport and to local government funding and all the rest of it that we can explore at our leisure, but not today. Tony, your final thoughts, just this interplay between those sort of things, and anything else you want to leave us with?
You would think I set that question up, Andrew, because there is an event at Manchester University, again, another webinar on the 14th of July on the very issue of the sustainability of home working and the role of technology. But again, some research that we have done has indicated that home working isn't the panacea for all, and largely because work is a social activity as much as an economic activity. The access to technology and the use of home working is a very privileged class of people. To be able to work from home are usually those that are at the higher end of a very polarized labor market, and the lower skilled, those who don't have access to technology and skills tend to not enjoy the privilege of home working. So it has a very unequal and sort of gender biased discrimination effect for sure. That we certainly know.
Lovely. It's always nice as the chair to have your biases confirmed by your eminent speakers. So I thank you on personal level just for confirming all the biases that I bring to any of these sorts of conversations. It's 12 o'clock, so we need to come to a close. Thanks again to the University of Manchester for partnering with us on this event. Obviously, fantastic thanks to Tony and to Eleanor for their brilliant contributions. Thank you all for joining and for your questions. We didn't get through all of them. We never can, but we got through some, and I thought we had quite a rich conversation about the nature of these sorts of issues, both in the short term and in the longer term. More details on all our research will be available on the website, and indeed we'll link to the various publications and thoughts that Tony was referring to in his talk as well. And more details on future events that we'll be running are also available on our website. But for now, thank you all for joining. Stay safe and go well. Thank you very much.